Jason Blackwood pulled his weathered Ford F-150 to a stop at the trailhead parking lot, the engine ticking as it cooled in the crisp morning air of Olympic National Park. The early June breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar and welcoming aroma that reminded him of countless backpacking trips over the years. At 42, with salt and pepper stubble and crow's feet that deepened when he smiled, Jason had spent most of his adult life exploring the wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He stepped out of the truck, stretching his back after the 3-hour drive from Seattle. Olympic National Park sprawled across nearly 1 million acres of Washington's Olympic Peninsula, encompassing glacier-capped mountains, ancient temperate rainforests, and wild coastlines. Jason knew these lands well, having worked as a park ranger here for over a decade before transitioning to his current job as an environmental consultant. Today, though, he wasn't here on business. "About time you showed up," called a familiar voice. Jason turned to see his longtime friend, Marcus Chen, leaning against his own vehicle, a sleek Subaru Outback that looked almost comically pristine next to Jason's mud-spattered truck. Marcus, a software engineer with a tech company in Seattle, was Jason's polar opposite in many ways. Meticulous where Jason was casual, analytical where Jason was intuitive. Yet their shared love of the outdoors had cemented a friendship spanning 20 years. "Some of us had real work to finish up before the weekend," Jason replied with a grin, opening his truck bed to access his gear. "I've been waiting for an hour," Marcus said, checking his watch. "Where's Diane? I thought she was coming with you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She's meeting us here, got held up at the hospital. Jason's wife Diane was an emergency room nurse, and her schedule was often unpredictable. Should be along any minute now. As if on cue, a compact Honda CR-V pulled into the parking area and Diane Blackwood emerged. At 39, she possessed the efficient movements and watchful eyes of someone accustomed to managing crises. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and despite having just finished a night shift, she looked energized by the prospect of 3 days in the wilderness. "Sorry I'm late," she called, grabbing her already packed backpack from the passenger seat. "Had a last-minute patient come in just as I was leaving." Jason walked over and gave her a quick kiss. Perfect timing. We were just about to start unloading. The 3 friends worked with practiced efficiency, checking their gear one final time before setting out. Their destination was a remote area of the park known as Enchanted Valley, about 15 miles from the trailhead. It was early in the season, and the higher elevations would still have snow, but the valley itself would be accessible. More importantly, it would be relatively empty of other hikers. "Did you remember to pack the new trail camera?" Marcus asked. As he adjusted his backpack straps, Jason patted the side pocket of his pack. "Got 3 of them, the newest models with enhanced night vision and motion sensors." He had recently invested in high-quality wildlife cameras, hoping to capture footage of the park's more elusive inhabitants. Roosevelt elk, black bears, perhaps even the occasional cougar. Still trying to become the next National Geographic photographer, Diane teased, knowing her husband's passion for wildlife photography. "Hey, those cameras are for scientific observation," Jason protested with a smile. "But if I happen to get a cover-worthy shot, I wouldn't complain." With final adjustments made to their gear, the small group set off on the trail, falling into a comfortable rhythm. The path started relatively flat, winding through ancient forests of massive Douglas firs and western hemlocks. Shafts of sunlight penetrated the canopy, illuminating patches of vibrant green moss that carpeted fallen logs and rocks. The air, grew more humid as they hiked deeper into the forest. The sounds of civilization gradually replaced by birdsong and the distant rush of water. They stopped for a brief lunch at a scenic overlook, sitting on fallen logs as they shared trail mix and sandwiches. Jason pulled out a topographic map, tracing their route with his finger. "If we maintain this pace, we should reach the first campsite by late afternoon," he said. "It's about 7 miles in. Then we can push for Enchanted Valley tomorrow." Marcus nodded, studying the map. "Looks good. The weather forecast is still clear for the next few days." "Clear skies through Monday," Diane confirmed. She was scrolling through her phone, capturing one last weather update before they lost signal completely. "Though they're saying there might be some unusual temperature drops at night. We should be prepared for it to get colder than normal." Jason frowned slightly. "That's odd for June, but we've got good gear, so we should be fine." They continued their journey, the trail gradually gaining elevation as it followed the course of the Quinault River. The rushing water grew louder as the afternoon progressed, occasionally visible through breaks in the trees. The path narrowed, in places requiring them to walk single file, with Jason leading, Diane in the middle, and Marcus bringing up the rear. Around mid-afternoon, Jason noticed something unusual on the trail ahead. A large branch, nearly the size of a small tree, lay across the path. It hadn't been wind-blown or fallen naturally. It appeared to have been deliberately placed. "That's strange," he muttered, approaching the obstruction cautiously. "What is it?" Diane asked, coming up beside him. Jason gestured to the branch. "This didn't fall here. Someone placed it across the trail." He examined the ends of the branch, which showed clean breaks rather than the splintered appearance of storm damage. Recently, too. Marcus joined them, adjusting his glasses as he studied. "The obstacle. Maybe park rangers, trail maintenance." Jason shook his head. "They'd clear obstacles, not create them, and they'd leave notices at the trailhead if there was trail work happening." They easily moved the branch aside and continued, but Jason felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The forest, which had seemed welcoming earlier, now held a watchful quality that raised the fine hairs on the back of his neck. He found himself scanning the dense vegetation on either side of the trail more frequently, though he couldn't articulate exactly what he was looking for. About a mile further, they encountered another oddity, a series of stones arranged in a distinct pattern across a small clearing just off the trail. 7 large rocks formed a rough circle, with smaller stones placed in what appeared to be deliberate positions within it. "Now that's definitely not natural," Marcus said, crouching to examine the arrangement. "Probably other hikers," Diane suggested. "People make rock stacks and circles all the time." Jason wasn't so sure. The stones were large, the kind that would require significant effort to move, and the pattern felt somehow different from the typical cairns or rock art left by casual hikers. Still, there was nothing inherently threatening about it, so after a few curious glances, they moved on. The trail steepened as the afternoon waned, requiring more exertion as they climbed higher into the mountains. They walked in silence for long stretches, conserving energy for the ascent. Jason had just paused to take a drink from his water bottle when a sound echoed through the forest. A long, low vocalization that was neither the call of any bird he recognized nor the howl of a wolf or coyote. It seemed to come from somewhere ahead of them, deeper in the valley. "What was that?" Diane asked, her voice hushed. Jason shook his head slowly. "Not sure. Could be elk. They sometimes make unusual sounds during mating season, though it's a bit early for that." "Didn't sound like any elk I've ever heard," Marcus commented, his normally analytical expression betraying a hint of unease. They stood listening for several minutes, but the sound didn't repeat. Eventually they resumed hiking, though Jason noticed they all moved more quietly now, as if by unspoken agreement. The feeling of being watched intensified, and twice he stopped abruptly, certain he'd caught movement in his peripheral vision, only to find nothing when he turned to look directly. By the time they reached the first designated campsite, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The site was located in a small clearing near the river, with established fire rings and flat areas for tents. To their relief, they had the place to themselves. No other hikers had ventured this far this early in the season. "Home sweet home for the night," Jason announced, dropping his pack with a satisfied grunt. "Let's get camp set up before we lose the light." They fell into their usual roles. Marcus assembling the tents with engineer-like precision, Diane organizing their food supplies and hanging the bear bag, and Jason gathering firewood and establishing their cooking area. Years of camping together had made them an efficient team, and within an hour their camp was fully functional. As darkness settled over the forest, they sat around a small, carefully managed fire, eating freeze-dried meals that tasted inexplicably delicious after a day of hiking. The flames cast flickering shadows across their faces as they recounted moments from the day's journey and made plans for tomorrow's push to Enchanted Valley. "Should be about 8 more miles to our destination," Jason said, studying the map by flashlight. "The terrain gets more challenging, but the views are worth it, assuming my legs still work tomorrow," Marcus joked, stretching his feet toward the fire. Despite his regular exercise routine in the city, the first day of a serious hike always tested different muscles. Diane was unusually quiet, her attention seemingly focused on the darkness beyond their campfire's glow. Jason noticed her distraction. "Everything okay?" he asked softly. She turned back to the fire, her expression thoughtful. "Just listening. It's so quiet out here tonight." She was right, Jason realized. The typical nighttime forest sounds, the hooting of owls, the rustle of small nocturnal animals, even the chirping of insects, seemed muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The only consistent sound was the rushing of the nearby river. Probably just the weather. "Or changing," Jason suggested, though he didn't entirely believe it. In his experience, unusual wildlife behavior often had meaningful causes. Diane mentioned earlier that temperatures might drop. As if to confirm his statement, a cool breeze swept through the campsite, causing the fire to flicker and prompting them to pull their jackets closer. The temperature was indeed falling faster than usual for a June evening. "I'm going to set up one of the trail cameras before we turn in," Jason said, reaching for his pack. "Might catch some nocturnal visitors. Just as long as those visitors are of the 4-legged variety," Marcus said with a forced laugh. "I'm not keen on finding out we're sharing these woods with some axe-wielding maniac." Jason selected a sturdy tree about 30 yards from their campsite, positioning the camera to capture a wide angle of the surrounding forest while still being within range of any animals that might be attracted to their scent. The camera was state-of-the-art, motion-activated with infrared night vision capability and a silent trigger mechanism that wouldn't startle wildlife. He secured it carefully to the tree trunk, checked its field of view, and activated it before returning to camp. "All set," he announced. "If anything larger than a squirrel comes within 50 feet of that direction, we'll have footage of it in the morning." They doused the fire properly before retiring to their tents, Marcus in his solo ultralight, Jason and Diane sharing their spacious 2-person model. The absence of ambient light allowed the stars to shine with remarkable clarity through the patches of open sky visible above the clearing. Under different circumstances, they might have stayed up stargazing, but after a full day of hiking, sleep beckoned irresistibly. Jason was drifting off, lulled by the sound of the river and Diane's steady breathing beside him, when a crack echoed through the forest, the unmistakable sound of a large branch breaking underfoot. His eyes snapped open, instantly alert. Years of backcountry experience had honed his senses to distinguish between the ordinary noises of the forest and those that signaled potential danger. He lay still, listening intently. For several minutes, nothing but silence followed the initial sound. He had nearly convinced himself it was just a random occurrence, perhaps a deadfall finally giving way under its own weight, when he heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving with slow purpose somewhere beyond the perimeter of their camp. Jason carefully extricated himself from his sleeping bag, trying not to wake Diane. He unzipped the tent just enough to peer out into the darkness. The clearing was silver blue in the moonlight, but the surrounding forest was a wall of impenetrable shadow. The footsteps had stopped, but he could sense a presence. Something watching from just beyond the reach of his vision, a low, musky odor drifted into the tent, unlike anything he'd encountered before in the wilderness. Not the typical scent of bear or deer or any familiar forest dweller. This smell was more pungent, with an almost primal quality that triggered some ancient warning system in his brain. Jason reached for his flashlight, debating whether to investigate further or remain in the tent. Before he could decide, the stillness was shattered by a sound that sent ice through his veins, a deep, guttural vocalization, similar to what they'd heard on the trail earlier, but much closer now, and unmistakably powerful. It wasn't quite a growl, nor a howl, but something in between, a sound that seemed to vibrate the very air around them. Diane stirred beside him. "What was that?" she whispered, now fully awake. "Not sure," Jason replied softly. "Something big." "Bear." Her voice was remarkably steady, a testament to her experience in high-pressure situations. Jason shook his head, though she could barely see the gesture in the darkness. "Doesn't sound like any bear I've ever heard." The vocalization came again, followed by the distinct sound of movement, something large moving through the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. Jason could hear Marcus stirring in his own tent. "Nearby. Jason," Marcus called in a hushed voice. "Are you hearing this?" "Yeah," Jason responded quietly. "Stay in your tent for now." Whatever was out there, Jason reasoned, hadn't approached their campsite directly, despite clearly being aware of their presence. Most predatory animals would either avoid human camps entirely, or, if desperate or habituated, would move in quickly to investigate food possibilities. This behavior, circling, vocalizing but maintaining distance, was unusual. For nearly 20 minutes they listened as the creature moved around the perimeter of their camp, never coming fully into the clearing, but never moving away either. Occasionally branches would snap or stones would scrape, marking its progress. Once, Jason thought he caught a glimpse of movement, something tall shifting position between two distant trees. But it was gone before he could focus on it clearly. Eventually, the sounds receded, moving off in the direction they had come from earlier that day. The three friends remained alert for another half hour, but when no further disturbances occurred, they tentatively accepted that whatever had visited their camp had moved on. "What the hell was that?" Marcus asked when they finally convened outside. Their tents, speaking in hushed tones, despite the apparent departure of their nocturnal visitor. "Could have been a lot of things," Jason said, though he was struggling to reconcile the experience with his extensive knowledge of local wildlife. "Black bear is most likely, though the vocalizations were unusual." "It sounded massive," Diane observed. "The footsteps were so heavy," Jason nodded. "Potentially a large male black bear. They can make quite an impression when they're moving through the forest at night." Neither Marcus nor Diane looked entirely convinced by this explanation, and truthfully Jason wasn't either. But in the absence of visual confirmation, speculating further seemed pointless. "The trail camera might have caught something," he suggested. "We can check it in the morning." They returned to their tents, though sleep came fitfully for all of them after the interruption. Jason found himself lying awake, mentally cataloguing the wildlife he knew inhabited Olympic National Park, trying to match what they'd experienced to known species. Nothing quite fit. Not bear, not cougar, not elk. The sound, the smell, the deliberate way it had circled their camp without approaching or retreating. When dawn finally broke, casting pale light through the forest canopy, Jason was already up and moving. He exited the tent quietly, leaving Diane still sleeping, and made straight for the trail camera. Marcus emerged from his tent as Jason was retrieving the device. "Anything?" Marcus asked, his voice hushed in the morning stillness. "Let's see," Jason replied, powering up the camera and navigating to the stored images. What he saw made his breath catch. The camera had indeed been triggered multiple times during the night. Most of the images showed nothing unusual. Empty, forest or small movements that might have been branches swaying in the breeze. But there was one photo, captured at 2:17 a.m., according to the timestamp, that sent a chill down his spine. The infrared image showed a partial view of something large moving between two trees. Only a section was visible, what appeared to be a massive shoulder and arm, covered in dark hair or fur. The perspective made it difficult to determine exact size, but comparing it to the surrounding vegetation suggested whatever this was stood significantly taller than a man. "What is that?" Marcus whispered, peering over Jason's shoulder at the screen. Jason shook his head slowly. "I'm not sure." He scrolled to the next image, captured just seconds later, but it showed only empty forest, as if whatever had triggered the camera had moved with surprising speed for its size. The remaining photos revealed nothing unusual. Diane joined them, immediately sensing their tension. "What's wrong? Did the camera catch something?" Jason wordlessly handed her the device, watching as her expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. "That can't be a bear," she said finally. "The proportions are all wrong. The shoulder is too high, and look at the way the arm hangs. It's more like a primate," Marcus finished, voicing what they were all thinking but hesitant to say. The implication hung in the air between them. Olympic National Park, like many wilderness areas in the Pacific Northwest, had its share of legends. Stories of a massive, bipedal creature that native peoples had various names for but modern culture typically called Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Jason had always regarded such tales with scientific skepticism, viewing them as interesting cultural folklore rather than zoological possibility. Yet the evidence before him, the strange arrangements on the trail, the unusual vocalizations, the heavy footsteps circling their camp, and now this ambiguous but undeniably strange image was challenging his certainty. "We should pack up and head back," Marcus suggested. His earlier enthusiasm for reaching Enchanted Valley notably diminished. Jason considered this, looking around their campsite in the growing morning light. Nothing appeared disturbed. Their food bag remained securely hung where Diane had placed it. If whatever had visited during the night had been interested in their supplies, it had made no attempt to access them. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he said finally. "This could still be explained by known wildlife, a bear with unusual coloration or posture caught at a strange angle by the infrared. A bear that walks on two legs, makes sounds unlike any bear vocalization, and deliberately places branches across hiking trails," Diane asked skeptically. Jason had no good answer for that. He glanced at his watch. "Look, it's early. Let's have breakfast, break camp, and discuss our options. Whatever it was, it didn't show any aggression. It was curious about us, nothing more." This reasonable suggestion helped restore a sense of normalcy, and they set about their morning routine, boiling water for coffee and oatmeal, filtering fresh water from the river, and gradually packing up their gear. The familiar activities calmed their nerves, though Jason noticed they all kept glancing toward the forest edge more frequently than usual. As they were nearly finished with their preparations, Jason decided to scout the perimeter of their campsite. Looking for any physical evidence of their nighttime visitor, he found it on the north side of the clearing, a series of depressions in the soft earth that stopped him cold. Footprints, but not those of any animal he recognized. They were enormous, easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions and a shape that resembled a human foot, only much larger and wider. The impressions were deep, suggesting whatever had made them carried significant weight. Jason crouched beside one of the clearer prints, studying it with a mixture of professional interest and growing unease. In his years as a ranger, he'd become adept at identifying animal tracks, the rounded pads of bear paws, the split hooves of deer and elk, the distinctive pattern of cougar prints. These matched none of those familiar patterns. He called Marcus and Diane over, and they stood in silence, staring at the undeniable evidence that something highly unusual had visited their camp. "I've never seen anything like it," Marcus admitted, his scientific mind clearly struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. Diane was more direct. "It's a footprint, a humanoid footprint that's larger than any human could make." Jason took out his phone and photographed the tracks from multiple angles, placing his own boot beside one for scale. His size 11 hiking boot looked almost childlike. "Next to the massive impression, we need to report this," he said finally. "Whatever it is, the Park Service should know about it." "Will they believe us?" Marcus asked. "This isn't exactly standard wildlife observation." Jason considered this. "I still have contacts in the Ranger Service, people who know I wouldn't make something like this up." He glanced at the partially packed camp. "But first, we need to decide whether we're continuing on or heading back." The 3 friends looked at each other, a silent communication born of years of shared adventures passing between them. Despite the unsettling discoveries, there was a shared reluctance to abandon their plans entirely. They had prepared for this trip for weeks, and Enchanted Valley was particularly beautiful this time of year. "It didn't harm us," Diane pointed out. "It had every opportunity if that was its intention, and we'll be more prepared now," Marcus added. "We know to keep the cameras ready and to be more alert." Jason nodded slowly. The rational part of his mind was still seeking conventional explanations, but another part, the primal instinct that humans carried from their evolutionary past, was already accepting the possibility that they had encountered something beyond conventional zoological categories. "Enchanted Valley it is then," he decided, "but we stay together at all times, make plenty of noise on the trail so we don't surprise anything, and set up multiple cameras at our next campsite." With their course determined, they finished packing and set off on the trail again, continuing deeper into the wilderness of Olympic National Park. The day was bright and clear, the forest alive with normal activity that helped dispel some of the lingering tension from the night before. Yet as they hiked, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the dense forest surrounding them, eyes were watching their progress. Intelligent eyes belonging to something that science told him couldn't exist, but which the evidence increasingly suggested did. The adventure that had begun as a routine wilderness expedition had transformed into something altogether different, a journey into territory where ancient legends and modern reality converged, in ways that would challenge everything Jason thought he knew about the natural world. The trail to Enchanted Valley grew steeper as the morning progressed, winding through increasingly dense stands of ancient trees draped with hanging moss. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that belied the tension still lingering among the 3 hikers. The rangers called this section the corridor, Jason explained as they navigated a particularly narrow stretch of path. The forest is so thick on either side that wildlife tends to use the trail just like humans do. Marcus adjusted his pack straps, scanning the dense vegetation. "Convenient for sightings, I guess. Less convenient if what we're potentially sighting is 9 feet tall and bipedal, We don't know that it's 9 feet tall, Jason countered, though without much conviction. The photo was partial, and perspective can be deceiving. The footprints weren't deceiving, Diane said quietly. Those were real. They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts as they continued their ascent. Jason found himself constantly alert, studying every shadow between the trees, every movement in his peripheral vision. The forest seemed to have taken on a watchful quality, as if the very trees were observing their passage. Around midday, they stopped at a small stream that crossed the trail for a water and snack break. As Diane refilled their bottles through a portable filter, Jason pulled out his map to check their progress. "We're making good time," he noted. "Should reach Enchanted Valley by late afternoon if we maintain this pace." Marcus nodded absently, his attention focused on something upstream. "Jason," he called, his voice carefully neutral, "you might want to see this." Jason followed his friend's gaze. About 20 yards upstream, where the water flowed from a jumble of large boulders, something unusual had been constructed. A complex arrangement of sticks and smaller branches had been woven between several rocks, creating what appeared to be a crude dam or weir. It was clearly not a natural formation. The placement was too deliberate, the construction too precise. "Beavers?" Diane suggested, though her tone indicated she didn't believe it. Jason shook his head. "Not their style, and we're too high up in the mountains for their typical habitat." He approached the structure carefully, examining it without touching. This was made by someone with opposable thumbs and spatial reasoning skills. "Or something," Marcus added quietly. The construction was remarkably intricate upon closer inspection. Smaller branches had been woven through larger ones, creating a filter-like system that allowed water to pass while potentially trapping objects. Or fish. "It's a fish trap," Jason realized. "A primitive but effective one. Native Americans used to build these, right?" Diane asked, coming to stand beside him. "Yes, but the tribes local to this area haven't actively used these techniques in the park for generations." Jason crouched down, studying how recently the work had been done. "And this is fresh. These branches haven't been in the water long. No algae growth, no water staining on the exposed parts." The implications hung silently between them. If, not park rangers or native fishermen, who, or what, had constructed such a device in this remote area? "We should keep moving," Marcus suggested, an edge of unease in his voice. They continued their journey with renewed vigilance. Twice more along the trail, they encountered unusual arrangements. A stack of rocks balanced in a way that defied natural explanation, and later, a series of bent saplings forming an arch over a small game trail that branched off from the main path. By mid-afternoon, the forest began to thin as they gained elevation, offering occasional views of the spectacular mountain landscape surrounding them. Snow-capped peaks rose in the distance, their lower slopes blanketed in emerald green. Under different circumstances, they would have paused frequently to appreciate the vistas, but today they pressed on with determined focus. "Listen," Diane said suddenly, stopping in her tracks. They all fell still. At first, Jason heard nothing unusual, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a Stella's jay. Then he noticed what had caught Diane's attention. The forest had gone strangely quiet. The background chorus of birdsong and insect sounds that had accompanied their hike had ceased, leaving an unnatural silence. "Something's nearby," Jason whispered, scanning the surroundings. Years in the wilderness had taught him to recognize the warning signs when wildlife sensed a predator's presence. They stood motionless, barely breathing, as they strained to detect any sound or movement. After nearly a minute of tense silence, a branch snapped somewhere off the trail to their right, a sharp, deliberate sound that could only have been made by something of substantial weight. Jason turned slowly toward the noise, keeping his movements smooth and non-threatening. Through a gap in the foliage, approximately 50 yards away, he caught a glimpse of movement, something large and dark shifting position behind a massive fallen log. "Don't run," he breathed, just loudly, enough for his companions to hear. Whatever it is, running might trigger a chase response. Another snap, closer this time. Whatever was out there was moving parallel to the trail, pacing them from within the cover of the dense forest. "Should we make noise?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. "Let it know we're aware of its presence?" Before Jason could answer, a deep, rumbling vocalization emanated from the trees, similar to what they had heard the previous night, but with a different cadence, almost like speech without recognizable words. The sound raised the hair on the back of Jason's neck, triggering some primal recognition that this was not a normal animal call. "I think it already knows we're aware of it," Diane whispered. The creature, Jason could no longer pretend to himself it was conventional wildlife, continued to move alongside them for nearly half a mile, occasionally making sounds or breaking branches, but never fully revealing itself. The experience was unnerving. They were clearly being observed, assessed, but not directly threatened. Finally, as the trail curved around the shoulder of a ridge, the presence seemed to recede. Birds gradually resumed their calls, and the tension in the air dissipated. All 3 hikers released breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. "That was definitely the same thing from last night," Marcus said, as they cautiously resumed walking. Jason nodded. "It's following us, or at least it's monitoring our progress through its territory." "Its territory," Diane repeated, giving Jason a significant look. "You're starting to believe, aren't you?" Jason considered his response carefully. "I believe we're encountering something unusual that doesn't fit neatly into known wildlife categories. Beyond that," he shrugged, "I'm keeping an open mind. A 9-foot-tall, bipedal, territory-marking primate in the Olympic Mountains would be a little more than unusual," Marcus pointed out. "It would be an undocumented species of massive scientific importance, or exactly what native legends have described for centuries," Diane added. They continued their discussion as they hiked, theories ranging from the skeptical, an unusually intelligent bear with physical abnormalities, to the fantastic, a relict population of primitive hominids somehow surviving undetected in the remote wilderness. The conversation helped diffuse some of their anxiety, transforming fear into scientific curiosity. By late afternoon, the terrain began to descend slightly as they approached their destination. The trail opened onto a spectacular view of Enchanted Valley, a broad, flat-bottomed glacial valley flanked by towering mountains. A pristine river meandered through meadows dotted with wildflowers, and in the distance stood the historic Enchanted Valley Chalet, a rustic 2-story wooden structure built in the 1930s that now served as a backcountry ranger station during peak season. "Wow," Marcus breathed, momentarily forgetting their earlier concerns. "It's even more beautiful than I remembered." "And completely empty," Jason noted. This early in the season, before the summer crowds arrived, they appeared to have the entire valley to themselves. The ranger station wouldn't be staffed for another 2 weeks. They made their way down to the valley floor, where designated camping areas were situated a safe distance from the river. As they set up their tents, Jason found himself frequently glancing toward the dense forest that bordered the valley's edge, half expecting to catch sight of their mysterious observer. "I'm going to set up all 3 cameras tonight," he announced as they finished establishing their camp. "Different angles, maximum coverage." "Good idea," Marcus agreed. "I'd like to know if our friend decides to pay another nocturnal visit." Jason selected 3 strategic locations, placing the cameras to cover different approaches to their campsite while ensuring overlapping fields of view. As he secured the final camera, he noticed something unusual on a nearby tree. 3 long, parallel marks scored into the bark about 7 feet above the ground. The spacing and depth suggested claws or perhaps fingernails, but the height and pattern didn't match any known bear markings he'd seen. Touching the marks gently, he found them fresh, the exposed inner bark still moist. Whatever had made these, scratches had done so recently, possibly within the past day. "Found something?" Diane called, noticing his prolonged examination. Jason beckoned her over, showing her the marks. "Tree scoring. Bears do something similar to mark territory, but not usually this high up, and the pattern is different." Diane studied the marks, her expression troubled. "It's almost like it's sending a message." "Marking boundaries, more likely," Jason said. "Many primates use tree scoring as territorial signaling, so we're in its territory," she concluded. Jason nodded grimly. "And it wants us to know it." As twilight descended over Enchanted Valley, they prepared dinner at a safe distance from their tents, following proper backcountry protocols despite the unusual circumstances. The valley was achingly beautiful in the fading light, with alpenglow, turning the surrounding mountain peaks various shades of pink and orange. "If we weren't being stalked by a possibly mythical forest creature, this would be perfect," Marcus commented, attempting humor that fell slightly flat. They ate quickly, the spectacular setting unable to fully dispel their underlying unease. As darkness settled over the valley, they built a small, controlled fire in the established fire ring, as much for comfort as for warmth. The flames created a circle of light that seemed fragile against the vast darkness beyond. In most indigenous traditions, Sasquatch isn't considered dangerous, Diane said as they sat around the fire. As a nurse with native ancestry on her mother's side, she had always been interested in traditional healing and legends. The stories usually describe them as shy, reclusive beings that avoid human contact. Most stories also describe them as a myth, Marcus pointed out. "Many things considered myths have biological explanations," she countered. "The line between folklore and natural history isn't always clear, especially with indigenous knowledge." Jason stared into the flames, considering. "If, and it's still a big if, what we're encountering is what some people call Sasquatch, then we're experiencing something that has successfully avoided scientific documentation despite centuries of human expansion. That suggests intelligence, not just instinct." "Intelligence means predictability," Marcus said. "We can anticipate its behavior to some extent. Or it means we're dealing with something that can anticipate us," Diane added quietly. The fire crackled. In the silence that followed, sparks rising toward the star-filled sky. Despite the vastness of the valley, Jason couldn't shake the feeling of being contained, observed from the shadowy forest edges. He found himself straining to detect any unusual sounds over the natural background noise of the wilderness at night. Around 10 o'clock, they decided to turn in, extinguishing the fire properly and securing their food in bear canisters placed well away from the tents. The valley was bathed in moonlight, giving it an otherworldly quality that would have been magical under different circumstances. "Remember, we have the cameras running," Jason reassured his companions. "If anything approaches during the night, we'll have evidence." They retreated to their respective tents, though Jason suspected none of them would sleep deeply. He lay awake beside Diane, listening to the gentle sounds of the river and the occasional hooting of an owl. Normal wilderness sounds that should have been comforting, but now seemed like fragile evidence of ordinary reality. It was nearing midnight when the first unusual sound reached them. A rhythmic thumping from somewhere near the valley's edge, like something solid striking a tree trunk at regular intervals. The sound continued for perhaps 2 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. "What was that?" Diane whispered, fully awake beside him. "Wood knocking," Jason replied, the term coming to him from research he'd once read about purported Sasquatch behavior. Some researchers believe they use it as a form of communication. They listened intently, and about 10 minutes later, a similar knocking pattern responded from the opposite side of the valley. The implications were clear and chilling. They were potentially hearing communication between at least two creatures positioned on different sides of the valley. "They're coordinating," Diane breathed, a note of awe in her voice despite the fear. The knocking exchanges continued sporadically for nearly an hour, sometimes close enough to make Jason tense in anticipation of an approach, other times so distant they were barely audible. Eventually, a new sound joined the nocturnal symphony. That same deep, guttural vocalization they had heard before, but with variations, almost like different phrases or sentences in an unknown language. Jason carefully unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The valley was silver blue in the moonlight, peaceful and still. Nothing moved in his field of vision, yet the sounds continued from the darkened forest edges, calls and responses that suggested complex communication rather than simple animal vocalization. Around 2 a.m., the sounds gradually subsided, leaving an expectant silence. Jason continued watching and listening, unwilling to relinquish his vigil despite his exhaustion. He was rewarded approximately 20 minutes later when he caught sight of movement at the forest edge, about 100 yards. From their camp, a large dark figure emerged partially from the trees, standing motionless at the boundary between forest and meadow. Even at that distance, in the limited moonlight, Jason could tell it was enormous, at least 7 feet tall, possibly taller, with a broad, powerful build. It stood upright on 2 legs, its stance unmistakably bipedal and surprisingly human-like. Despite its massive proportions, Jason's heart hammered in his chest as he watched, barely daring to breathe. The figure remained at the forest edge for perhaps 30 seconds, clearly observing their campsite, before melting back into the darkness of the trees with remarkable silence for its size. He waited another hour, but the figure did not reappear, and no further sounds disturbed the night. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep. Dawn arrived with a heavy mist clinging to the valley floor, shrouding the landscape in ghostly white. Jason woke feeling gritty-eyed and tense, the events of the night sitting heavily in his mind. When he described what he'd seen to Marcus and Diane over breakfast, their reactions were a mixture of fascination and concern. "Did you get a clear look at it?" Marcus asked eagerly. "Details about its face? Proportions?" Jason shook his head. It was too far away, and the lighting wasn't good enough. Just a silhouette, really, but unmistakably bipedal and massive. "And you're sure it was watching us?" Diane questioned. "Absolutely. It positioned itself with a clear line of sight to our camp and stood there observing for at least half a minute." "The cameras," Marcus remembered suddenly. "Let's check if they caught anything." They retrieved the trail cameras with nervous anticipation. The first, positioned to cover the approach from the south, showed nothing unusual, just mist and darkness and the occasional small nocturnal animal. The second camera, facing east, had captured several images triggered by movement, but these proved to be false positives from branches swaying in the night breeze. It was the third camera, pointed toward the northern edge of the forest, where Jason had spotted the figure that delivered. Among dozens of empty frames was a single chilling image, a massive, dark silhouette standing at the forest boundary, exactly as Jason had described. Though still indistinct, the proportions were clear enough. An enormous bipedal figure with long arms, a conical head set directly on powerful shoulders without much of a neck, and a posture that, while upright, wasn't quite human. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, staring at the image. "That's not a bear." "No," Jason agreed quietly. "It's not." Diane studied the photo with intense focus. "We need to take measurements, establish scale. If we can determine its actual height based on surrounding vegetation." According to the image timestamp, this was taken at 2:14 a.m., Jason noted, exactly when I saw it. They spent the next hour analyzing the photo, comparing the figure to known features in the landscape to estimate its size. Their calculations, though approximate, suggested a creature standing between 8 and 9 feet tall, with proportional breadth. "This changes everything," Marcus said finally, his voice a mixture of scientific excitement and trepidation. "If we can document this properly with multiple forms of evidence, that's assuming we can get close enough for better evidence. Without putting ourselves at risk," Jason cautioned. "So far it's been observing rather than approaching, but we don't know if that will change." "There's something else we should consider," Diane added, her expression troubled. The wood knocking and vocalizations came from different directions. "There's more than one of them around this valley." The realization settled heavily. They weren't dealing with a single unusual creature, but potentially a group, possibly a family unit or small community. "The question is," Jason said after a long pause, "what do we do now?" They discussed their options over another cup of coffee. Continuing their planned 3-day trip meant 2 more nights in Enchanted Valley, potentially under surveillance by multiple unknown creatures. Heading back immediately meant a long hike, with no guarantee that they wouldn't be followed. "I say we stay," Marcus argued. "This is an unprecedented opportunity for documentation. As long as they're maintaining distance, the risk seems minimal." "But we don't know their intentions," Diane countered. "Last night they were communicating with each other, possibly coordinating. That suggests social sophistication and strategic thinking." Jason considered both perspectives. "If they wanted to harm us, they've had multiple opportunities. The fact that they're observing rather than engaging suggests curiosity rather than aggression." In the end, they decided to stay, but with heightened precautions. They would remain together at all times, maintain awareness of their surroundings, and set up additional visual documentation, including using Jason's high-quality camera with telephoto lens for any daylight sightings. They spent the morning exploring the immediate vicinity of their camp, including the historic chalet. The rustic structure was securely locked for the off-season, but they examined the exterior with interest. On the north side of the building, Jason noticed something unusual. Several massive footprints in the soft earth near the foundation, similar to those they'd found at their previous campsite, but even more clearly defined in the damp soil of the valley. "Look at the depth of that impression," Marcus noted, crouching beside one of the prints. "The creature must weigh at least 500 pounds to sink so deeply. And it was here recently," Diane added, touching the edge of a footprint gently. "The soil hasn't had time to dry or erode." They photographed and measured the prints carefully, creating a detailed record. The clearest impression measured 17 inches from heel to toe, with distinct anatomical features that resembled a human foot scaled up to enormous proportions. 5 toes, arch structure, heel pad, Jason enumerated, pointing to each feature. The biomechanics would be similar to human locomotion, but the size suggests adaptations for supporting much greater weight. As they continued their documentation, a sound from the nearby forest caught their attention. A sharp crack, like a branch breaking under significant pressure. All 3 froze, eyes turning toward the tree line approximately 50 yards away. For a breathless moment, nothing moved. Then slowly, branches parted, and a massive figure stepped partially into view. It remained half concealed by foliage, but enough was visible to confirm their suspicions. A towering, hair-covered humanoid form standing fully upright, watching them with unmistakable intelligence. Jason slowly raised his camera, his hands trembling slightly as he focused the telephoto lens. The creature remained still, as if allowing the documentation, its dark eyes reflecting awareness that Jason found more unsettling than any physical characteristic. "It's letting us see it," Diane whispered. "This is deliberate." For nearly 20 seconds, the standoff continued. 3 humans and 1 impossible being regarding each other across a divide of species and understanding. Then, with deliberate slowness, the creature raised one massive hand in what could only be interpreted as a gesture of acknowledgement before stepping back into the dense cover of the forest. The encounter left them shaken but exhilarated. Jason reviewed the photos he'd managed to capture, slightly blurred but clearly showing a large, hair-covered figure with a distinctly non-human yet humanoid appearance. The telephoto lens had captured details they hadn't been able to distinguish with the naked eye: a heavy brow ridge, broad nose, and powerful jaw, set in a face that seemed to blend primate characteristics with something uniquely its own. "This is beyond anything I could have imagined," Marcus breathed, examining the images on Jason's camera display. "The anatomical features, the proportions, it's like something from the evolutionary record that shouldn't still exist." "But it does exist," Diane said quietly, "and it just made contact. Not accidental observation, direct, intentional contact." Jason nodded, his scientific skepticism finally giving way to acceptance of the extraordinary. "We're not dealing with an animal, at least not in the conventional sense. This is a sentient being with social structures, communication, and apparent cultural behaviors like territorial marking." The magnitude of their discovery was overwhelming. If properly documented and verified, this would represent one of the most significant zoological findings in modern history, proof that a large, intelligent primate species had survived alongside human civilization, while remaining largely undetected. Yet as Jason stared at the forest where the creature had disappeared, a troubling thought emerged. If these beings had managed to avoid scientific confirmation despite centuries of human encroachment, perhaps they had done so by choice rather than chance. And if that were true, what right did he and his companions have to expose them now? The ethical implications added a new dimension to their already complex situation. As they returned to their camp, the excitement of discovery was tempered by the weight of responsibility that had suddenly fallen on their shoulders. What they decided to do with their evidence, and how they chose to interact with the beings, observing them, would have consequences extending far beyond their personal adventure in Olympic National Park. The haunting wail that echoed through Enchanted Valley that night awakened all three hikers simultaneously. It was 3:17 a.m. according to Jason's watch, and the sound, part mournful cry, part thunderous roar, seemed to reverberate from the very mountains themselves. "What was that?" Marcus whispered, his voice crackling through the two-way radio they'd set up between tents. Before Jason could respond, the ground shook with rhythmic impacts, massive footfalls approaching their campsite with deliberate speed. Not the cautious circling of previous encounters, but direct approach. "Stay in your tents," Jason commanded, though his own instincts screamed to run. Through the thin fabric, they watched as enormous shadows surrounded their camp. Not one creature, but three massive silhouettes illuminated by moonlight. The largest stood nearly 9 feet tall, its broad shoulders and powerful frame unmistakable even in silhouette. Then, with strength that defied comprehension, the creature grasped their food cache and ripped it from the tree where it had been. Carefully suspended, tossing it aside like a child's toy, the other two beings began systematically dismantling their camp, collapsing tents, scattering equipment, destroying their cameras. "They're driving us out," Diane realized, as Jason pulled her from their collapsing shelter. The three friends huddled together as their campsite was demolished around them. Yet, despite the creature's overwhelming power, no harm came to the humans themselves. This wasn't an attack, it was an eviction. When the destruction was complete, the largest Sasquatch approached to within 10 feet of the terrified hikers. In the moonlight, they could clearly see its face, ancient eyes reflecting intelligence and purpose in a countenance both familiar and utterly alien. It raised one massive hand, pointing deliberately toward the trail that would lead them out. Of the valley, the message couldn't have been clearer. Leave, Now, they didn't argue. Gathering only essential survival gear from the wreckage, they began their exodus by flashlight, the three massive beings escorting them to the valley's edge, before melting into the forest shadows. They hiked through the night and the following day without stopping, driven by adrenaline and the burning certainty that they had crossed an invisible boundary and received their final warning. 6 weeks later, Jason sat at his kitchen table, turning a memory card in his fingers. It contained the only surviving images, recovered from his camera's internal memory after its destruction, clear, unmistakable evidence of what they had encountered. Marcus and Diane sat across from him, their expressions solemn. "We have to decide," Jason said quietly. "The world would never be the same if we release these." Diane reached over, gently taking the memory card. "They've survived this long by remaining legend. Who are we to take that from them?" "But the scientific significance," Marcus began. "Some mysteries belong to themselves," Jason interrupted. "Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed." After long discussion, they reached unanimous agreement. The memory card was formatted, the images lost forever. Their written accounts, detailed and honest, were sealed in an envelope marked, "To be opened 50 years after our deaths." That night, Jason dreamed of ancient eyes watching from primeval forests, guardians of wild places where humans were merely visitors, never masters. He woke understanding that some truths belong to the shadows, and some encounters change us not through what we share with the world, but what we choose to protect from it. In Olympic National Park, mist still shrouds the valleys at dawn, and occasionally hikers report strange sounds in the deepest forests, but the beings that make them remain as they have always been. Shadows glimpsed at the corner of vision, legends walking just beyond the reach of certainty, guardians of wilderness, that endure through the power of mystery. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.